Augusta Tabor by Caroline Bancroft. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Augusta Tabor, her side of the scandal. She is a blonde, I understand, and paints, but I have never seen her. Augusta Tabor made this remark about Baby Doe in the course of a long interview that she gave to a reporter for the Denver Republican. The account appeared on October 31st, 1883, and carried several heads. One of these read, "Mrs. Tabor, No. 1, makes some spicy revelations." Augusta received her caller in the elegantly furnished sitting room of her 20-room mansion. The house stood at the corner of 17th Avenue and Lincoln Street, but faced Broadway. Its address was 97 Broadway, and was entered along a spruce-lined circular driveway. The house and its surrounding block of land had been part of her divorce settlement from the millionaire silver king, Horace A. W. Tabor. The divorce in the January preceding had been a national scandal, only to be topped by the even greater scandal of her former husband's remarriage. The wedding was performed on March 1st in Washington, where Tabor had gone to serve a 30-day term as senator. It was attended by a number of political bigwigs, including President Chester Arthur, but they came without their wives. The women drew a sharp line against recognizing "that blonde," the former Mrs. Elizabeth McCourt Doe. The best people continued to draw that line. When the Tabors returned to Denver after their honeymoon, no one called on the second Mrs. Tabor. But shortly afterward Augusta came home from California, where she had taken her broken heart. 250 people organized a surprise reception for her at her palatial residence. But in the following months Augusta brooded. "I do not consider myself divorced from Mr. Tabor," she told the reporter. "The whole proceedings were irregular. If it were not for my son, Maxie, I would commence suit to-morrow to have the divorce annulled. I repeat, it was illegal." "Do you think Mr. Tabor would live with you if you were to have the divorce set aside?" the reporter asked. "No, I couldn't hope for that, but it would be a great deal of satisfaction to know that that woman was no more to him than she was before he gave her his name and mine." Augusta glanced over to the table where she had laid down her sewing, a piece of silk patchwork. The reporter thought she looked lonely and sad-faced. Then she sighed. "Well, there has been scandal enough, God knows. It would make a big volume if it were put in book form. It has aged me." A new chapter of the scandal was being enacted that week. Horace Tabor was suing his old friend and business manager, William H. Bush, for $25,000 because of sundry debts, including a $2,000 embezzlement as former manager of the Tabor Grand Opera House of Denver. Bush had retaliated with a countersuit against Tabor, asking payment for all sorts of flagrant services performed for the Silver King. The juicy trial was the sensation of the week. Augusta had been called to testify for Bush. Her testimony had been very titillating, and she had startled the court even further by crossing over and sitting down beside Tabor while she tried to engage him in conversation. "Mr. Tabor has changed a great deal," she commented to the reporter. "He used to detest women of that kind. He would never allow me to whitewash my face, however much I desire to do so. She wants his money, and will hang to him as long as he has got a nickel. She don't want an old man." The reporter ventured the suggestion that the 52-year-old Tabor was not such an old man. "Oh, yes, he is. He dyes his hair and mustache. I noticed him in the courtroom the other day. He was afraid to draw his handkerchief across his mouth for fear of staining it. I also noticed that the hair on his temples, which is gray, was colored nicely to give him a rejuvenated appearance." Augusta and the reporter conversed for 2 solid columns of small, tightly packed print, while she revealed a number of intimate matters. The details of the secret, illegal first divorce which Tabor had procured from her in March 1882 were set forth. Augusta claimed the charges had been a lie from beginning to end, and gave conclusive data in refutation. "Mr. Tabor used to be a truthful man. He is changed now," she remarked indignantly. After a pause she continued with, "I understand that she has her family quartered at his home. I mean all in this country. I understand that a fresh invoice is coming over from Ireland." The reporter smiled at her sally and encouraged her to talk on. She showed him 3 scrapbooks that she was making of clippings about Tabor. These scrapbooks are now in the Western History collection of the Denver Public Library, and contain this particular interview along with many others. Augusta explained that at first she had only saved newspaper articles that spoke well of him, but now she was saving everything, and the later clippings were all derogatory. "Is there really 17 in that McCourt family? Well, there is one thing that Mr. Tabor cannot say, and that is that any of my relatives ever lived off him. Not one of them ever received a cent from him. That woman will break him up." Augusta liked to talk to newspaper people. She herself had contributed to Eastern newspapers and been a member of the Colorado State Press Association. In July 1879 she attended a meeting of the association at Manitou in company with Flora Stevens, a correspondent for the Kansas City Times. Miss Stevens later wrote Augusta up under the heading "A Rich Man's Wife," in which she said that Augusta kept an extensive journal during the trip to Manitou. Unfortunately, this particular example of Augusta's authorship has not been preserved. Augusta also liked to visit newspaper offices. In May 1879 she brought a visitor, her dainty niece, Susie Marston, to see the various departments of the Rocky Mountain News. This girl was from Augusta, Maine, the family home town after which Augusta had been named. Augusta took her niece on trips around Colorado, and in 1889 chaperoned her on a diversified tour of Europe, while they traveled with the George Tritches of Denver. The first Mrs. Tabor's habit of calling on writers has preserved for us a very fine autobiography. In September of 1883, Mrs. Alice Polk Hill of Denver, who had lived in Colorado for a decade or so, decided to compile a book by collecting reminiscences and informal bits of history. She spent several months traveling about the state to obtain material. Some time prior to the publication of her book, in 1884, she arrived in Leadville and stayed at the Clarendon Hotel. Augusta, who was visiting her sister, Mrs. Melvina L. Clark, in Leadville at the time, came to call. Mrs. Hill was delighted, and later described Augusta as a frail, delicate-looking woman with pleasing manners. More importantly, Mrs. Tabor No. 1 wrote out a detailed account of her early marriage, much of which Mrs. Hill used in her first book, Tales of the Colorado Pioneers, but which has survived intact in the Denver Republican. Her romance with Tabor, a Vermont stonecutter, began in Maine in August 1853, when Augusta L. Pierce was 20 years old and Horace Austin Warner Tabor was 22. He came to work for her father, a contractor. After a couple of years' employment he fell in love with the boss's daughter. A 2-year engagement followed, while Tabor homesteaded a 160-acre farm in Riley County, Kansas. "On January 31st, 1857, we were married in the room where we first met," Augusta recalled. Farming in Kansas proved bleak, arduous, and lonely for the 24-year-old bride, and unprofitable for her husband. When the news of gold in Colorado broke, the Tabors joined the rush. On April 5, 1859, they set out in an ox-drawn covered wagon, with 2 men friends and their 16-month-old baby son, Maxie, who was teething. They also took along several cows to provide milk. The journey to Denver took them until June 20th. They camped there for 2 weeks because the cattle were footsore, and then moved to a site near Golden. Here the men decided to push on to Gregory Diggings, now Central City, and they went afoot since there was no adequate road for a wagon. Leaving me and my sick child in the 7x9 tent that my hands had made, the men took a supply of provisions on their backs, a few blankets, and bidding me be good to myself, left on the morning of the glorious 4th. My babe was suffering from fever, and I was weak and worn. My weight was only 90 pounds. How sadly I felt, none but God, in whom I then firmly trusted, knew. 12 miles from a human soul save my babe. The only sound I heard was the lowing of the cattle, and they, poor things, seemed to feel the loneliness of the situation and kept unusually quiet. Every morning and evening I had a round-up all to myself, Augusta wrote. After 3 long, weary weeks, the men returned. On the 26th of July they again loaded the wagon and started into the mountains. Traveling by way of Russell Gulch, it took them 3 weeks to reach Payne's Bar, now Idaho Springs. She remarked, "Ours was the first wagon through, and I was the first white woman there, if white I could be called, after camping out 3 months." The men cut logs, laid them up 4 feet, and put the 7x9 tent on top for a roof. Horace went prospecting, and Augusta opened a business. She baked bread and pies, gave meals, and sold milk from their cows. Horace found no gold, but Augusta was very successful. She made enough money to buy their unpaid-for farm in Kansas, and to keep them through the winter in Denver. In February Horace returned to his prospect, but found his claim had been jumped. He decided to go prospecting farther afield, on the Arkansas, and returned to Denver to make plans. They traveled by way of Ute Pass, and were a month on the road before they reached South Park. Now she waxed lyrical. "I shall never forget my first vision of the park. The sun was just setting. I can only describe it by saying it was one of Colorado's sunsets. Those who have seen them know how glorious they are. Those who have not cannot imagine how gorgeously beautiful they are. The park looked like a cultivated field with rivulets coursing through, and herds of antelope in the distance." After 2 hazardous crossings of the ice-caked and tumultuous Arkansas, and after several weeks of unsuccessful placering, when they could not separate heavy black particles from the gold, they arrived in California Gulch. It was May 8th, 1860. The first thing after camping was to have the faithful old oxen butchered that had brought us all the way from Kansas. Yes, from the Missouri River 3 years before. We divided the meat with the miners in the gulch, for they were without provisions or ammunition. Once again Augusta was the first woman in the camp, and once again the men built her a primitive log cabin. This one had a sod roof, no window, and a dirt floor. She promptly went into business, and Horace went prospecting. As the Tabors were the only people in the upper end of the gulch who owned a gold scales, Augusta added weighing dust to her duties of taking boarders and doing laundry. In a few weeks 10,000 men were crowded in the gulch, and a mail and express office was needed. Augusta was appointed postmistress of Oro City. "I was very happy that summer," she added. By September the 20th Horace had accumulated $5,000 in gold dust from his claim. He gave $1,000 worth of this dust to Augusta, and she prepared to leave the mountains to spend the winter with her father and mother. I put my wardrobe, what there was of it, in a carpet bag, and took passage with a mule train that was going to the Missouri River. I was 5 weeks in crossing, and cooked for my board. Horace and Maxcy also went to Maine that winter, but Augusta did not mention this. With that $1,000 I purchased 160 acres of land in Kansas, adjoining the tract we already owned. My folks dressed me up, and in the spring I bought a pair of mules and a wagon in St. Joe to return with, which took about all my money. Horace spent the $4,000 that was left of the gold dust for flour in Iowa on the way back. In the spring they opened a store in Augusta's cabin. While he mined the claim, Augusta waited on customers and raised her son. She even transported gold to Denver on horseback for the express office. In order to fool highway robbers, Tabor carried a small amount of gold, while large amounts were hidden under her skirts, enjoying the protection of chivalry to ladies. That summer of 1861 the store was more profitable than mining, because the easy placer gold was nearly played out. The camp fell off rapidly and by autumn was practically deserted. The Tabors decided to try the other side of the Mosquito Range and the booming camp of Buckskin Joe. Again they opened a store, and again it was selected as the post office. Horace had no better luck with mining in South Park than in Oro, and so resigned himself to their small business venture. But he still dreamt of bonanzas and hopefully grub-staked penniless prospectors. The agreement was that in return for supplies which he gave them, they would share any rich finds. Augusta viewed the practice with disfavor. When the Printerboy mine was expanded in 1868 in California Gulch, the Tabors moved back to Oro City. This time they erected a 4-room log cabin about a mile above the present site of Leadville, and settled down to their usual routine of running a general store. For 10 more years, bringing the total to 18, Augusta kept at her labors, and Horace cherished his dreams. As the years passed, Augusta's natural New England frankness grew more tart. She found Horace's easy-going ways irritating. His off-hand generosities made no sense to a woman who knew the value of a hard-earned dollar. Or perhaps some psychic intuition warned Augusta that that very same trait would bring her eventual heartbreak, and she was trying subconsciously to ward off the blow. The blow came disguised as good fortune. In 1877 the news leaked out that those heavy particles of black sand, which had been so difficult for the placer miners to separate from gold, were really bits of lead-silver carbonates. A second rush to California Gulch began. The newcomers were silver seekers, and chose the lower part of the gulch in which to settle. The Tabors decided to move their Oro City store a mile farther down, and selected a site on the south side of Chestnut Street, a door below the Harrison Avenue corner. They built a 1.5-story log and frame building, with sleeping quarters upstairs and dining and kitchen arrangements to the rear. Business boomed. Tabor had to hire 2 clerks to take care of the post office alone. Soon he was forced to open a banking department, since he owned an ordinary iron safe which sat outside the counter. Everyone wanted to deposit their cash in his safe. The cashier divided his time between the dry goods and grocery divisions, and the receipt of deposits and writing of exchange. Tabor hired still more clerks, and expanded jovially in the balmy atmosphere of his new importance. In January 1878 the settlement comprised some 70 tents, shanties, and log cabins. The inhabitants decided to call a meeting, effect an organization, and choose a name. Leadville was selected, although a few people thought Cloud City was more poetic. A short while afterward they voted Tabor to the mayorship, and officially confirmed his year-long office with a city election in April. Tabor was now worth between $25,000 and $30,000. As sleeping and eating facilities were at a premium, the Tabors decided to build a residence for themselves, where Augusta could serve meals, and to allow the clerks to sleep above the store. They chose a site at 310 Harrison Avenue, way off from the settlement, and began to build in the spring. Meanwhile Tabor was handing out grub stakes and still dreaming. Then the momentous day of his castles in Spain arrived. On Sunday, April 21st, 1878, 2 German prospectors, August Rischer and George Theodore Hook, asked him for a stake while Tabor was sorting mail. Postmaster Tabor told them to pick out what they needed, and the men chose about $17 worth of supplies, mostly groceries. They drew up an agreement that Tabor was entitled to a third of what they found. A few days later they came back and asked for a second handout. They had staked a claim, and they needed shovels, a hand switch, drills, and blasting powder to sink a shaft. This brought the total outlay to some $60. Early in May, Augusta was coming downstairs one morning when August Risher burst into the store. As she told the story to Flora Stevens, his hands were full of specimens. He rushed towards her and shouted, "We've struck it! We've struck it!" Augusta said she was rather frigid to him. "Risher, when you bring me money instead of rocks, then I'll believe you." But it was true. Their mine, the little Pittsburgh, netted Tabor $500,000 in the following 15 months. He bought the chrysolite, which proved to be another bonanza. Augusta continued to keep boarders during the summer and Tabor to supervise the store's activities. But then Tabor began to splurge, and in the autumn they sold out. The fall election had made Tabor lieutenant governor of Colorado, so they planned to move to Denver. In January 1879 Tabor rented, and the next month purchased, the Henry C. Brown house at 70th and Broadway, paying $40,000. According to Augusta, when her husband took her to see it, she was very mindful of the quick rises and equally rapid descents of Colorado fortunes. Augusta took one look at her husband's idea of a new home and said, "I will never go up these steps, Tabor, if you think I will ever have to go down them." 35 curious callers appeared the first day she was at home. She remarked sarcastically, "I would scarcely know how to return the call of the woman next door, who arrived in a carriage." Tabor provided the means for returning the call. It was a $2,000 carriage, an exact replica of the one driven by the White House coachman around Washington. "La," she told Flora Stevens, "if we had only had the money that is in that carriage when we began life." Delegations from the various churches also came to call, each seeking the Tabor's membership. Augusta remarked, "I suppose Mr. Tabor's and my souls are of more value than they were a year ago." Poor Augusta! Time was running out. Tabor's answer to her tartness was to spend his evenings in the variety halls and bordellos. As his interests and investments widened, he took the most seductive inmates traveling with him. The newspapers reported that Tabor had given clothes, jewelry, furs, and furbelows to 3 or 4 women, one paper said 5, so that they could appear as Mrs. Tabor. One that he singled out was Alice Morgan, an Indian club swinger at the Grand Central Variety Hall in Leadville. Next he was charmed by Willie DeVille in Lizzie Allen's parlor house in Chicago, and he brought Willie West with him. Augusta discovered the affair, and the miscreants promised to part. But this was a ruse. Tabor kept on seeing her secretly, and took Willie on a trip to New York. There she was so indiscreet about their relations that a woman in the hotel tried to blackmail the Silver King. Tabor told Willie she talked too much, and made her a gift of $5,000 to soften the blow of saying good-bye. Augusta preserved an interview, with many more details than these, that Willie gave to a St. Louis reporter a couple of years after the affair. Apparently Willie was still talking too much. In September 1879 Tabor sold out his interest in the little Pittsburgh for a cool $1 million. He bought the Matchless for $117,000, which later proved the greatest bonanza of all, and over 800 shares of stock in the First National Bank in Denver. Then he and Augusta went east for 6 weeks while he made further investments, notably land in South Chicago. On November the 5th the Tabors returned to Denver, and Horace left for Leadville to see to the completion and opening of the Tabor Opera House. Augusta remained in Denver. Tabor did not return, even for Christmas. His bachelor suite on the second floor of the Opera House, with its handy passageway across to Bill Bush's Clarendon Hotel, proved too delightful for a man whose eyes wandered. Augusta and he began to quarrel more violently. During 1880 they appeared together at balls of the Tabor Hose Company in Denver and of the Tabor Light Cavalry in Leadville, and when Tabor entertained ex-President and Mrs. Grant in the Cloud City. The two couples sat together in the left-hand box for the second act of Hours, and then left to attend a ball in the general's honor. This was July 23rd, 1880, a momentous date for 47-year-old Augusta, not because she had met a president, but because just about that time Horace ceased to be her husband. In the autumn, back in Denver, Horace gave her $100,000, following his usual practice of making a parting gift. In January 1881, Tabor left the Broadway mansion irrevocably, and established residence in a suite at the Windsor Hotel, of which he was part owner. What happened was that, some time during the spring or summer, on one of his frequent trips to Leadville, Tabor had met Baby Doe. She was 25 and he was 49. They were introduced by Bill Bush, who had known the Dresden doll beauty as Mrs. Harvey Doe during her 2.5-year residence in Central City. Bill Bush had been proprietor of the Teller House, and had also known her husband and in-laws. She had obtained a divorce from Harvey Doe in March 1880 for adultery and non-support, and shortly after arrived in Leadville. Baby Doe said that it was love at first sight on her part. With Tabor the feeling grew on him. She became his mistress almost immediately, but it was not until January 1881 that he began to think of divorce and remarriage. Augusta put her foot down. She refused successive overtures of a handsome settlement in return for a divorce. Augusta knew what was going on. In December 1880 she bought a third interest in the Windsor Hotel from Charles L. Hall of Leadville. The other third was owned by Bill Bush, who also managed the hotel, assisted by her son Maxie. In the next months Augusta used her ownership to check up regularly on activities at the hotel. When Tabor brought Baby Doe down from Leadville and installed her at the Windsor, the two women must have passed in the lobby frequently. Augusta realized a fine monthly profit from her Windsor investment, and in April 1881 she treated herself to a trip abroad for several months. Both Tabor and Bush wanted to buy out her share. Tabor did not like her making such a damned nuisance of herself, going in and out of the rooms, and Bush wanted to obtain a controlling interest in the hotel. Augusta kept on saying no. No divorce and no hotel sale. When Augusta returned from Europe she found her husband had risen to new heights. He was being considered for a senatorship, and he had finished building the Tabor Grand Opera House in Denver. The citizens were tendering a ceremony and watch fob to him on the opening night. Augusta wrote him a letter apologizing for what she had said in the heat of passion. She also asked to be allowed to come to the opening night of the Tabor Grand, and to go with him to Washington as a senator's wife. This letter turned up among Baby Doe's paper at her death. No one knows how or if it was answered, but the Tabor box was empty on September 5th, 1881, the gala occasion Augusta wanted to attend. In April 1882 Augusta instituted a suit for payment of $50,000 a year alimony, despite the fact that she was not divorced. She listed Tabor's holdings and their specific worth, an impressive tabulation, which brought the total to $9,410,000. The suit caused a lot of scandal, damaged Tabor politically, but accomplished nothing for Augusta, since it was thrown out of court as illegal. Augusta gave in on the hotel sale petition first. She sold her interest in the Windsor to Bush for close to $40,000 in May 1882. Finally, on January 2nd, 1883, she gave Tabor a divorce in exchange for property worth about $300,000. She caused a sensation at the divorce trial by reiterating, "Not willingly, oh God, not willingly." It was this public statement of hers to the judge which made her feel that the divorce was not valid. Amos Steck, Augusta's lawyer, summed up the whole 5 years of public quarreling and scandal when he talked about her to a reporter. "Oh, she knows all about his practices with lewd women. I never saw such a woman. She is crazy about Tabor. She loves him, and that settles it." For years Augusta hoped that Baby Doe would tire of Horace, and, crestfallen, he would come back to his first wife. She thought that when the money was gone, the young hussy would flit. She told reporters she was building up her own fortune, and hanging on to her large house in order that she might take care of Tabor in his old age. But Augusta was wrong. She had underestimated her rival. When the silver panic of 1893 reduced the former millionaire to poverty, his pretty blonde wife stuck like glue. Belatedly, Augusta realized the true character of Baby Doe. In 1892 the first Mrs. Tabor sold her house on Broadway and moved across the street to the newly opened Brown Palace Hotel. Although Maxcy and Bill Bush were the managers and lived there also, Augusta did not enjoy hotel life. Her health was starting to fail, and she went to California for the winter, seeking a milder climate. There, in Pasadena, on February 1st, 1895, at the age of 62, she died, her social position still secure, if not showy, and her fortune built to $1.5 million. She said in her own words when Tabor was at his richest, "I feel that in those early years of self-sacrifice, hard labor, and economy, I laid the foundation for Mr. Tabor's immense wealth. Had I not stayed with him and worked by his side, he would have been discouraged, returned to the stone-cutting trade, and so lost his big opportunity." All Colorado agreed with her at the time, and then the mills of the gods ground slowly, and exceedingly fine. Tabor's immense wealth evaporated. But its going did not bring Horace back to her. He clung to Baby Doe until the end, 4 years after Augusta's death. Never once was there the slightest rumor of any fidelity of his to her after 1881, and none of Baby Doe to him after their first meeting. It must have been galling to Augusta. Maxcy Tabor inherited the money his father had husbanded with such business acumen. He brought her body back from California, and she was buried in Riverside Cemetery. With the passage of the years, Maxcy was laid to rest in Fairmount beside his wife, and Horace Tabor in Mount Olivet beside Baby Doe. Augusta lies alone in an old-fashioned cemetery, as alone as she lived her last 15 years, terribly alone. For many years of her middle life Augusta was called Leadville's First Lady. The nickname was spoken in affection and in admiration, and she was interviewed for the Leadville papers under that heading. Yes, she was a first lady in many ways, courageous and industrious and civic. The tragedy of her life lay in the fact that, although she was beloved of many, she lost the key to the only heart she wanted. End of Augusta Tabor by Caroline Bancroft. Recording by Lynn Thompson.
God in the Constitution by Robert Greene Ingersoll. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to learn how to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. God in the Constitution by Robert Greene Ingersoll.
All governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed.
In this country, it is admitted that the power to govern resides in the people themselves, that they are the only rightful source of authority. For many centuries before the formation of our government, before the promulgation of the Declaration of Independence, the people had but little voice in the affairs of nations. The source of authority was not in this world. Kings were not crowned by their subjects, and the scepter was not held by the consent of the governed. The king sat on his throne by the will of God, and for that reason was not accountable to the people for the exercise of his power. He commanded, and the people obeyed. He was Lord of their bodies, and his partner, the priest, was Lord of their souls. The government of earth was patterned after the kingdom on high. God was a supreme autocrat in heaven, whose will was law, and the king was a supreme autocrat on earth, whose will was law. The God in heaven had inferior beings to do his will, and the king on earth had certain favorites and officers to do his. These officers were accountable to him, and he was responsible to God. The feudal system was supposed to be in accordance with the divine plan. The people were not governed by intelligence, but by threats and promises, by rewards and punishments. No effort was made to enlighten the common people. No one thought of educating a peasant, of developing the mind of a laborer. The people were created to support thrones and altars. Their destiny was to toil and obey, to work and want. They were to be satisfied with huts and hovels, with ignorance and rags, and their children must expect no more. In the presence of the king they fell upon their knees, and before the priest they groveled in the very dust. The poor peasant divided his earnings with the state because he imagined it protected his body. He divided his crust with the church, believing that it protected his soul. He was the prey of throne and altar. One deformed his body, the other his mind, and these two vultures fed upon his toil. He was taught by the king to hate the people of other nations, and by the priest to despise the believers in all other religions. He was made the enemy of all people except his own. He had no sympathy with the peasants of other lands, enslaved and plundered like himself. He was kept in ignorance, because education is the enemy of superstition, and because education is the foe of that egotism often mistaken for patriotism. The intelligent and good man holds in his affections the good and true of every land. The boundaries of countries are not the limitations of his sympathies. Caring nothing for race or color, he loves those who speak other languages and worship other gods. Between him and those who suffer, there is no impassable gulf. He salutes the world and extends the hand of friendship to the human race. He does not bow before a provincial and patriotic god, one who protects his tribe or nation and abhors the rest of mankind. Through all the ages of superstition, each nation has insisted that it was the peculiar care of the true God, and that it alone had the true religion, that the gods of other nations were false and fraudulent, and that other religions were wicked, ignorant, and absurd. In this way, the seeds of hatred had been sown, and in this way have been kindled the flames of war. Men have had no sympathy with those of a different complexion, with those who knelt at other altars and expressed their thoughts in other words, and even a difference in garments placed them beyond the sympathy of others. Every peculiarity was the food of prejudice and the excuse for hatred. The boundaries of nations were at last crossed by commerce. People became somewhat acquainted, and they found that the virtues and vices were quite evenly distributed. At last subjects became somewhat acquainted with kings, peasants had the pleasure of gazing at princes, and it was dimly perceived that the differences were mostly in rags and names. In 1776 our fathers endeavored to retire the gods from politics. They declared that all governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. This was a contradiction of the then political ideas of the world. It was, as many believed, an act of pure blasphemy, a renunciation of the deity. It was, in fact, a declaration of the independence of the earth. It was a notice to all churches and priests that thereafter mankind would govern and protect themselves. Politically, it tore down every altar and denied the authority of every sacred book, and appealed from the providence of God to the providence of man. Those who promulgated the Declaration adopted a constitution for the great republic. What was the office or purpose of that constitution? Admitting that all power came from the people, it was necessary, first, that certain means be adopted for the purpose of ascertaining the will of the people, and second, it was proper and convenient to designate certain departments that should exercise certain powers of the government. There must be the legislative, the judicial, and the executive departments. Those who make the laws should not execute them. Those who execute laws should not have the power of absolutely determining their meaning or their constitutionality. For these reasons, among others, a constitution was adopted. This constitution also contained a declaration of rights. It marked out the limitations of discretion so that in the excitement of passion men shall not go beyond the point designated in the calm moment of reason. When man is unprejudiced and his passions subject to reason, it is well he should define the limits of power so that the waves driven by this storm of passion shall not overbear the shore. A constitution is for the government of man in this world. It is the chain the people put upon their servants as well upon themselves. It defines the limit of power and the limit of obedience. It follows, then, that nothing should be in a constitution that cannot be enforced by the power of the state, that is, by the army and navy. Behind every provision of the Constitution should stand the force of the nation. Every sword, every bayonet, every cannon should be there. Suppose, then, that we amend the Constitution and acknowledge the existence and supremacy of God. What becomes of the supremacy of the people? And how is this amendment to be enforced? A constitution does not enforce itself. It must be carried out by appropriate legislation. Will it be a crime to deny the existence of this constitutional God? Can the offender be proceeded against in the criminal courts? Can his lips be closed by the power of the state? Would not this be the inauguration of religious persecution? And if there is to be an acknowledgment of God in the Constitution, the question naturally arises as to which God is to have this honor. Shall we select the God of the Catholics, he who has established an infallible church presided over by an infallible pope, and who is delighted with certain ceremonies and placated by prayers uttered in exceedingly common Latin? Is it the God of the Presbyterian with the 5 points of Calvinism, who is ingenious enough to harmonize necessity and responsibility, and who, in some way, justifies himself for damning most of his own children? Is it the God of the Puritan, the enemy of joy? Of the Baptist, who is great enough to govern the universe and small enough to allow the destiny of a soul to depend on whether the body it inhabited was immersed or sprinkled? What God is it proposed to put in the Constitution? Is it the God of the Old Testament, who was a believer in slavery and who justified polygamy? If slavery was right then, it is right now. And if Jehovah was right then, the Mormons are right now. Are we to have the God who issued a commandment against all art, who is the enemy of investigation and of free speech? Is it the God who commanded the husband to stone his wife to death because she differed with him on the subject of religion? Are we to have a God who will reenact the Mosaic Code and punish hundreds of offenses with death? What court, what tribunal of last resort is to define this God? And who is to make known his will? In his presence, laws passed by men will be of no value. The decisions of courts will be as nothing. But who is to make known the will of this supreme God? Will there be a supreme tribunal composed of priests? Of course, all persons elected to office will either swear or affirm to support the Constitution. Men who do not believe in this God cannot so swear or affirm. Such men will not be allowed to hold any office of trust or honor. A God in the Constitution will not interfere with the oaths or affirmations of hypocrites. Such a provision will only exclude honest and conscientious unbelievers. Intelligent people know that no one knows whether there is a God or not. The existence of such a being is merely a matter of opinion. Men who believe in the liberty of man, who are willing to die for the honor of their country, will be excluded from taking any part in the administration of its affairs. Such a provision would place the country under the feet of priests. To recognize a deity in the organic law of our country would be the destruction of religious liberty. The God in the Constitution would have to be protected. There would be laws against blasphemy, laws against the publication of honest thoughts, laws against carrying books and papers in the mails in which this constitutional God should be attacked. Our land would be filled with theological spies, with religious eavesdroppers, and all the snakes and reptiles of the lowest natures, in the sunshine of religious authority, would uncoil and crawl. It is proposed to acknowledge a God who is the lawful and rightful governor of nations, the one who ordained the powers that be. If this God is really the governor of nations, it is not necessary to acknowledge him in the Constitution. This would not add to his power. If he governs all nations now, he has always controlled the affairs of men. Having this control, why did he not see to it that he was recognized in the Constitution of the United States? If he had the supreme authority and neglected to put himself in the Constitution, Is not this, at least, prima facie evidence that he did not desire to be there? For one, I am not in favor of the God who has ordained the powers that be. What have we to say of Russia, of Siberia? What can we say of the persecuted and enslaved? What of the kings and nobles who live on the stolen labor of others? What of the priest and cardinal and pope who wrest even from the hand of poverty the single coin thrice earned? Is it possible to flatter the infinite with a constitutional amendment? The Confederate States acknowledged God in their Constitution, and yet they were overwhelmed by a people in whose organic law no reference to God is made. All the kings of earth acknowledge the existence of God, and God is their ally. And this belief in God is used as a means to enslave and rob, to govern and degrade the people whom they call their subjects. The government of the United States is secular. It derives its power from the consent of man. It is a government with which God has nothing whatever to do, and all forms and customs, inconsistent with the fundamental fact that the people are the source of authority, should be abandoned. In this country there should be no oaths. No man should be sworn to tell the truth, and in no court should there be any appeal to any supreme being. A rascal, by taking the oath, appears to go in partnership with God, and ignorant jurors credit the firm instead of the man. A witness should tell his story, and if he speaks falsely, should be considered as guilty of perjury. Governors and presidents should not issue religious proclamations. They should not call upon the people to thank God. It is no part of their official duty. It is outside of and beyond the horizon of their authority. There is nothing in the Constitution of the United States to justify this religious impertinence. For many years, priests have attempted to give our government a religious form. Zealots have succeeded in putting the legend upon our money, "In God we trust." And we have chaplains in the Army and Navy, and legislative proceedings are usually opened with prayer. All this is contrary to the genius of the Republic, contrary to the Declaration of Independence, and contrary really to the Constitution of the United States. We have taken the ground that the people can govern themselves without the assistance of any supernatural power. We have taken the position that the people are the real and only rightful source of authority. We have solemnly declared that the people must determine what is politically right and what is wrong, and that their legally expressed will is the supreme law. This leaves no room for national superstition, no room for patriotic gods or supernatural beings, and this does away with the necessity for political prayers. The government of God has been tried. It was tried in Palestine several thousand years ago, and the God of the Jews was a monster of cruelty and ignorance, and the people governed by this God lost their nationality. Theocracy was tried through the Middle Ages. God was the governor, the Pope was his agent, and every priest and bishop and cardinal was armed with credentials from the Most High, and the result was that the noblest and best were in prisons, the greatest and grandest perished at the stake. The result was that vices were crowned with honor and virtues whipped naked through the streets. The result was that hypocrisy swayed the scepter of authority, while honesty languished in the dungeons of the Inquisition. The government of God was tried in Geneva when John Calvin was his representative, and under this government of God the flames climbed around the limbs and blinded the eyes of Michael Servetus, because he dared to express an honest thought. This government of God was tried in Scotland, and the seeds of theological hatred were sown that bore through hundreds of years the fruit of massacre and assassination. This government of God was established in New England, and the result was that Quakers were hanged or burned, the laws of Moses reenacted, and the witch was not suffered to live. The result was that investigation was a crime, and the expression of an honest thought a capital offense. This government of God was established in Spain, and the Jews were expelled, the Moors were driven out, Moriscos were exterminated, and nothing left but the ignorant and bankrupt worshippers of this monster. This government of God was tried in the United States when slavery was regarded as a divine institution, when men and women were regarded as criminals because they sought for liberty by flight, and when others were regarded as criminals because they gave them food and shelter. The pulpit of that day defended the buying and selling of women and babes, and the mouths of slave traders were filled with passages of Scripture defending and upholding the traffic in human flesh. We have entered upon a new epoch. This is the century of man. Every effort to really better the condition of mankind has been opposed by the worshippers of some god. The church in all ages and among all peoples has been the consistent enemy of the human race. Everywhere and at all times it has opposed the liberty of thought and expression. It has been the sworn enemy of investigation and of intellectual development. It has denied the existence of facts, the tendency of which was to undermine its power. It has always been carrying faggots to the feet of philosophy. It has erected the gallows for genius. It has built the dungeons for thinkers. And today the Orthodox Church is as much opposed as it ever was to the mental freedom of the human race. Of course, there is a distinction made between churches and individual members. There have been millions of Christians who have been believers in liberty and in the freedom of expression, millions who have fought for the rights of man. But churches, as organizations, have been on the other side. It is true that churches have fought churches, that Protestants battled with the Catholics for what they were pleased to call the freedom of conscience, and it is also true that the moment these Protestants obtained the civil power, they denied this freedom of conscience to others. Let me show you the difference between the theological and the secular spirit. Nearly 300 years ago, one of the noblest of the human race, Giordano Bruno, was burned at Rome by the Catholic Church, that is to say, by the triumphant beast. This man had committed certain crimes. He had publicly stated that there were other worlds than this, other constellations than ours. He had ventured the supposition that other planets might be peopled. More than this, and worse than this, He had asserted the heliocentric theory, that the earth made its annual journey about the sun. He had also given it as his opinion that matter is eternal. For these crimes he was found unworthy to live, and about his body were piled the faggots of the Catholic Church. This man, this genius, this pioneer of the science of the 19th century, perished as serenely as the sun sets. The infidels of today find excuses for his murderers. They take into consideration the ignorance and brutality of the times. They remember that the world was governed by a God who was then the source of all authority. This is the charity of infidelity, of philosophy. But the church of today is so heartless, is still so cold and cruel, that it can find no excuse for the murdered. This is the difference between theocracy and democracy, between God and man. If God is allowed in the Constitution, man must abdicate. There is no room for both. If the people of the great republic become superstitious enough and ignorant enough to put God in the Constitution of the United States, the experiment of self-government will have failed, and the great and splendid declaration that all governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed will have been denied, and in its place will be found this: all power comes from God, priests are his agents, and the people are their slaves. Religion is an individual matter, and each soul should be left entirely free to form its own opinions and to judge of its accountability to a supposed supreme